Hello guys, Dr. Spooks here. If you enjoy my videos, please click the like button. It's the only way YouTube's algorithm really notices me. I would be very grateful to you. The Appalachian Mountains stretched before Alex in a breathtaking expanse of green and gray, their peaks rolling like the waves of a frozen ocean. This was his first hunt in the region, though he was no stranger to the wilderness. At 30, Alex had spent nearly half his life in the woods, hunting deer and elk, honing his skills with his trusted rifle and sidearm. But the Appalachians were different. Older, wilder, and steeped in stories he'd always dismissed as local lore. He parked his truck at the edge of a dirt trail, slinging his rifle over his shoulder and securing his sidearm at his hip. The air smelled clean but carried an undercurrent of damp earth and decay, the scent of an ancient forest. His plan was simple: hike deep into the woods, set up camp, and track deer at dawn. The locals had warned him about the labyrinthine trails and advised against straying too far, but Alex welcomed the challenge. By mid-afternoon, Alex had ventured several miles into the wilderness. The trail was narrow and overgrown, the trees towering above him like cathedral columns. The forest was alive with the sound of birds and rustling leaves, but something felt off. It wasn't the terrain. He'd hiked rougher trails before, but the forest's oppressive atmosphere. The deeper he ventured, the more the world seemed to close in around him, the trees pressing closer, their twisted branches forming jagged shadows. That's when he saw it, a face, faint and fleeting, etched into the bark of a massive oak tree. Alex stopped, blinking, his hand instinctively resting on the grip of his sidearm. The face was gone. He took a step closer, examining the bark. There was nothing but the natural grooves and knots of the wood. "Get a grip," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. But as he continued, more faces began to appear. They were never clear, always at the edge of his vision. Subtle shifts in the bark that seemed to follow him. At first he dismissed it as a trick of the light, his mind playing games. Yet, as the sun began to dip lower, the faces seemed to grow more distinct, their expressions carved in silent anguish. He tried to distract himself by focusing on his surroundings. Carved into several trees were strange symbols, circles, lines, and intersecting patterns that resembled ancient runes. They weren't the kind of marks left by hunters or hikers. Some were deep gouges, others shallow scratches, but all of them radiated an air of malevolence. Alex stopped again, this time to make camp. The light was fading quickly, and he knew better than to navigate unfamiliar woods at night. He pitched his tent in a small clearing and lit a fire, the flickering flames casting long shadows on the surrounding trees. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. As night fell, the forest grew unnervingly quiet, the usual symphony of insects and nocturnal animals absent. Alex stared into the fire, gripping his rifle tightly. The faces and symbols lingered in his mind, a warning he couldn't decipher. Something about this place wasn't right, and he was only beginning to understand how deep that wrongness went. Alex woke to a forest shrouded in mist. The morning air was cold and damp, clinging to his skin like a second layer. He hadn't slept well, his dreams plagued by disjointed images of trees twisting into grotesque shapes and faces emerging from the darkness. He shook off the lingering unease and packed up his gear, determined to make the most of the day. As he trekked deeper into the woods, the symbols on the trees became more frequent and intricate. Some were shallow etchings, others carved so deeply the bark had peeled away entirely, revealing raw, pale wood underneath. A few of the designs seemed to pulsate with an almost hypnotic rhythm, drawing his gaze longer than he intended. He shook his head to clear it and pressed on. The faces returned, this time more defined. They seemed to shift and stretch as he moved past, their anguished expressions frozen in silent screams. Alex stopped, heart pounding, and scanned the area. The forest was unnaturally still. No birds chirped, no leaves rustled, just an oppressive silence that made the hair on his neck stand on end. "Hello?" he called, his voice sounding small in the vast emptiness. No answer. He gritted his teeth and pushed forward, his rifle at the ready. The further he went, the more he felt the forest was alive, watching, waiting. Every snap of a twig beneath his boots felt amplified, echoing in the stillness. He considered turning back, but dismissed the thought. He wasn't the kind of man to scare easily, and he wasn't about to let a few strange sights ruin his trip. By midday, the trail had all but disappeared, swallowed by the dense undergrowth. Alex pulled out his compass only to find the needle spinning erratically. He tapped it against his hand, frowning. It didn't make sense. He hadn't wandered far enough for magnetic interference to be an issue. The nearest iron deposits were miles away, according to his research. The sensation of being watched grew stronger. Every now and then he'd catch a glimpse of movement in the corner of his eye, shadows darting between the trees. When he turned to look, there was nothing. He quickened his pace, his hand never straying far from his sidearm. Then he found it. A clearing. In its center stood a crude stone altar, its surface dark and stained with something he didn't want to identify. Around it were poles adorned with deer skulls, their hollow eyes staring at him. Some had antlers that branched impossibly wide, twisting like the gnarled limbs of the trees. Alex's stomach churned. This wasn't some old hunter's camp or a relic from settlers. It felt deliberate, recent. The ground around the altar was disturbed, as if a group of people had gathered here not long ago. He crouched to examine the tracks, barefoot, dozens of them, leading in all directions. The forest seemed to close in around him, the air growing heavier. He straightened, scanning the tree line, his instincts screaming danger. That's when he heard it. A faint, rhythmic chanting carried on the wind. It was low and guttural, words he couldn't understand, but felt deep in his bones. Alex gripped his rifle tighter. He was no longer alone in these woods. Alex crouched low, his heart pounding as the chanting grew louder. It was coming from deeper within the forest, beyond the clearing. The rhythmic tones carried an unnatural weight, as if the very air vibrated with their sound. He debated his options. Every fiber of his being told him to leave, to retrace his steps and get out of the woods while he still could. But curiosity, tinged with a hunter's instinct for tracking, anchored him to the spot. He moved cautiously around the clearing, his boots silent against the mossy ground. His eyes scanned the forest, searching for movement, while his ears strained to pick up any sound beyond the chanting. The deer skulls mounted on poles seemed to follow him, their empty sockets filled with malice. He avoided looking at the altar, the dark stains on its surface making his stomach twist. The tracks around the clearing became more apparent as he studied them. Barefoot impressions, each set pointing toward a single direction where the chanting originated. The prints were too large for children and too erratic to be from seasoned hikers. They weaved in strange patterns as if the people who left them had danced or shuffled in unison. Alex hesitated, then followed the tracks. The forest grew darker as he moved, the trees so tightly packed they blocked out the sun. The symbols on their trunks became more frequent and detailed. Some looked like crude faces, others spirals or jagged shapes that made his eyes ache if he stared too long. A foul smell began to permeate the air, a mix of decay and something sharp, almost metallic. Then he saw them. At first it was just movement, a flicker of robes slipping between the trees. He froze, crouching behind a thick trunk, his rifle at the ready. He waited, his breath shallow as the figures came into view. They wore long, tattered robes of deep red, their faces obscured by hoods. On their heads were deer skulls, complete with massive antlers that looked far too large for the human necks supporting them. Alex counted 5 of them, each moving in a slow, deliberate procession. They carried long staffs, the ends adorned with feathers, bones, and what looked disturbingly like hair. They moved toward another clearing ahead where the chanting was louder now, almost deafening. He crept closer, every step calculated. As he reached the edge of the second clearing, the full scene unfolded before him. A large stone altar stood in the center, similar to the one he'd seen earlier but far larger. Around it were more robed figures, at least a dozen, all chanting in unison. Their voices created a dissonant harmony that set his teeth on edge. At the altar's base, an intricate circle had been carved into the dirt, filled with the same strange symbols he'd seen on the trees. Within it, something writhed, a small, dark shape that Alex couldn't quite make out from his vantage point. He squinted, trying to get a clearer look, when a branch snapped beneath his boot. The chanting stopped. The robed figures turned as one, their skull-faced masks staring directly at him. Alex's blood ran cold. The forest around him fell silent, save for the sound of his own rapid breathing. Alex's instincts took over, and he ducked behind the nearest tree, gripping his rifle so tightly his knuckles ached. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, drowning out the oppressive silence that followed the snap of the branch. He peeked around the trunk, only to see the figures in their crimson robes spreading out, their skull-masked faces sweeping the forest. They were looking for him. Moving carefully, Alex began to retreat, keeping low and using the thick underbrush for cover. His training as a hunter gave him the edge. He knew how to move silently, even in terrain like this. But something about these people unsettled him. They didn't search like ordinary men. Their movements were methodical, almost synchronized, as though they were guided by a shared mind. A guttural sound split the air, a harsh, animalistic cry that reverberated through the woods. Alex froze, his stomach twisting. It wasn't human. He couldn't place the sound, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once, carried on the wind. His breath quickened as he glanced around, his fingers brushing the grip of his sidearm. The robed figures stopped, their heads tilting in unison toward the source of the cry. Then, without warning, they moved as one, turning and disappearing into the forest's shadows. Alex remained frozen, his eyes darting between the trees, his muscles tense and ready to fire. But the figures didn't return. Only after several long, agonizing minutes did he begin to breathe again. He didn't stop retreating until he was sure he'd put significant distance between himself and the altar. The forest felt different now, darker, more alive. Every shadow seemed to shift, every rustle of leaves a potential threat. He found a small rise in the terrain and climbed to its top, setting up a temporary camp where he could have a clearer view of his surroundings. Night fell quickly, and with it came a biting cold. Alex huddled near a small fire, his rifle within arm's reach. He tried to rationalize what he'd seen. Maybe it was some strange Appalachian ritual, a local tradition he didn't understand. But the blood stains on the altar, the masks, the chanting, none of it felt like folklore. It felt like danger. Sleep eluded him at first, but exhaustion eventually won. He drifted into a fitful slumber, only to find himself trapped in a vivid nightmare. In the dream, the faces on the trees were no longer subtle. They emerged fully formed, their mouths open in silent screams as their eyes followed his every move. The forest floor turned to mud beneath his feet, pulling him down with each step. Figures in red robes emerged from the darkness, their deer skull masks gleaming in the moonlight. They reached for him, their hands claw-like, dragging him toward a massive stone altar that loomed impossibly tall. When he woke, his heart was hammering, his body drenched in sweat. The fire had burned low, and the forest was cloaked in an unnatural silence. His instincts told him he wasn't alone. He grabbed his rifle and scanned the area, his pulse racing. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, a figure in a red robe stood motionless, its skull mask glinting faintly in the dying firelight. Alex's grip tightened on his rifle as he stared at the motionless figure in the red robe. It was standing at the edge of the tree line, just close enough for him to make out the grotesque antlers sprouting from its skull mask. The figure didn't move, but Alex could feel its gaze boring into him, even from this distance. He raised the rifle, centering the figure in his sights. His finger hovered over the trigger. But as he adjusted his aim, the figure turned and disappeared silently into the forest, swallowed by the darkness. Alex's breath came in shallow bursts as he scanned the area, his eyes darting between the trees. He was a skilled hunter, but this wasn't like tracking deer or elk. These people, if they were people, moved with an unnatural silence, as though the forest itself conspired to mask their movements. He extinguished the fire and packed up his camp quickly, moving deeper into the woods. He couldn't afford to stay in one place, not when he was being hunted. His every step felt heavy, the forest pressing in around him. The faces on the trees were no longer faint impressions. They were grotesque and detailed, their expressions frozen in agony, and their eyes seemed to follow him with every step. Hours passed as Alex tried to put distance between himself and the cult. The sun never fully broke through the dense canopy, leaving the forest in a perpetual twilight. He stopped when he stumbled upon another clearing, his stomach sinking at what he saw. This one was larger than the first. Its centerpiece a massive stone altar adorned with crimson cloth and intricate carvings. The carvings were similar to the symbols on the trees, but far more complex, etched deep into the stone. The ground surrounding the altar was trampled, the soil dark and disturbed. He crouched low, scanning the area for any sign of movement, but the clearing was empty. For now. Alex approached cautiously, his rifle raised. He noticed small objects scattered near the altar, animal bones, charred remnants of what might have been candles, and crude wooden figurines carved into grotesque shapes. His stomach turned as he examined the area further. Near the base of the altar, he spotted scraps of fabric, a torn hiking jacket, a piece of nylon from a backpack. They weren't old. Someone had been here recently. As he scanned the clearing, his eyes caught something chilling. Hanging from a low branch was a crude talisman fashioned from twigs, feathers, and what looked like human hair. It swayed gently, though there was no breeze. He reached up to grab it, but as his fingers brushed the object, a sound froze him in place. The chanting had returned. Low and guttural, it resonated through the forest, coming from somewhere beyond the clearing. It was rhythmic, the kind of sound that made his skin crawl. He ducked into the shadows, positioning himself behind a thick tree trunk as he watched the edge of the clearing. The chanting grew louder, closer. Then from the darkness, they emerged. A procession of robed figures stepped into the clearing, their movements eerily synchronized. At their center, two of them carried something heavy. A person. Alex's breath caught in his throat as he realized it was a woman. She was unconscious, her arms and legs bound with thick rope. Her head lolled to the side, her face pale. They were heading toward the altar. Alex's muscles tensed as he assessed the situation. There were too many of them to take head-on, even with his rifle. He had one advantage. They didn't know he was there. He watched as they placed the woman on the altar, their chanting reaching a fever pitch. His mind raced. He had to do something, and fast. Alex's pulse hammered as he watched the cultists surround the altar. The woman lay motionless on the stone slab, her chest rising and falling faintly. Whatever they had done to her, she was alive, for now. The robed figures moved with eerie precision, their antlered skull masks gleaming in the dim light as they chanted in guttural tones. He counted at least a dozen of them. Too many for a direct confrontation, but he couldn't leave her there. He shifted slightly, gripping his rifle tighter, the stock pressing into his shoulder. He needed to act, but his hunter's instincts told him to wait for the perfect moment. The chanting stopped abruptly. One of the figures stepped forward, taller than the rest, with a more elaborate set of antlers crowning his mask. The leader. In his hands, he held a curved blade, its edge glinting ominously. The others knelt, lowering their heads in reverence as the leader approached the altar. He raised the blade high, and the air seemed to vibrate with unseen energy. "No time," Alex muttered under his breath. He steadied his aim, centering the rifle's sight on the leader's chest. Taking a deep breath, he squeezed the trigger. The crack of the gunshot shattered the oppressive silence, reverberating through the forest. The leader staggered, clutching his chest as he crumpled to the ground. For a moment, the clearing was frozen in shock. Then chaos erupted. The robed figures turned toward the tree line, their movements frantic as they searched for the source of the shot. Alex didn't hesitate. He fired again, dropping another cultist before slinging his rifle over his shoulder and drawing his sidearm. He dashed toward the altar, his boots pounding against the earth. The cultists moved to intercept him, but they were slow, their movements sluggish and uncoordinated compared to his. He dropped two more with precise shots, their bodies crumpling into the dirt. One lunged at him, swinging a staff adorned with bones and feathers. Alex sidestepped the blow and fired, the figure collapsing mid-swing. Reaching the altar, he holstered his sidearm and quickly untied the woman. Her eyes fluttered open, hazy with confusion. "Can you stand?" he asked, his voice urgent. I think so," she stammered, her voice weak. He helped her to her feet, supporting her weight as she swayed unsteadily. The remaining cultists regrouped, their guttural chants rising once more. This time the sound was sharper, more aggressive. Alex glanced back and saw them advancing, their movements quicker now, more determined. "Move!" he barked, pulling the woman toward the tree line. The two of them plunged into the forest, Alex's rifle slung over his shoulder, his sidearm ready in his hand. The cultists gave chase, their chants echoing through the trees like a war cry. The woman stumbled and Alex caught her, practically dragging her forward. "You need to keep up," he urged. "We can't stop." "I'm trying," she panted, her voice strained. The forest seemed to conspire against them, the dense undergrowth snagging their clothes and slowing their escape. Alex fired blindly over his shoulder, the flashes of his gun briefly illuminating the twisted faces of their pursuers. For every cultist he slowed down, two more seemed to emerge from the darkness. The forest closed in around them as Alex and the woman stumbled through the dense undergrowth. The cultists were relentless, their guttural chants ringing out behind them like a predatory howl. Alex's heart pounded, adrenaline surging through his veins as he half-dragged, half-supported the woman who struggled to keep pace. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice trembling with exhaustion. "I don't know," Alex replied through gritted teeth, "but they're not going to stop." A flash of red caught his eye and he spun, firing his sidearm. The shot rang out and a robed figure dropped to the ground with a sickening thud. The others hesitated momentarily, their masks gleaming like pale ghosts in the moonlight, before resuming their pursuit. "We have to find higher ground," Alex said, pulling her up a narrow incline. His hunter's instinct screamed at him to gain a vantage point, somewhere they could regroup and plan their next move. The incline was steep and slippery, the loose soil giving way beneath their boots. Alex pushed the woman forward, his rifle slung across his back as he scrambled up the slope. His lungs burned with effort, but he didn't dare stop. The chanting grew louder, closer. Finally, they reached a rocky outcrop overlooking the forest. Alex turned and raised his rifle, scanning the tree line for movement. The woman collapsed beside him, gasping for air. "They'll find us here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not if I find them first," Alex replied, his tone grim. He spotted movement below, a group of figures weaving through the trees, their red robes fluttering like bloodied banners. He fired, the rifle's sharp crack echoing through the forest. One cultist fell, then another. The remaining figures scattered, ducking behind trees for cover. "They're flanking us," Alex muttered, his eyes narrowing. He turned to the woman. "Can you hold this?" He handed her his sidearm, and she hesitated before taking it. "Point and shoot," he said, "only if they get close." She nodded, her hands trembling as she gripped the weapon. Alex focused on the figures below, his hunter's precision taking over. He picked off another cultist, but there were too many, and they moved with an unnatural fluidity, closing the distance with alarming speed. "They're coming!" the woman shouted, pointing toward the slope. Several cultists were climbing toward them, their antlers swaying like grotesque crowns. Alex grabbed a loose rock and hurled it down the incline, knocking one climber off balance. Another lunged at him, and he swung the butt of his rifle, connecting with a sickening crunch. The figure crumpled, rolling back down the slope. "We can't stay here," Alex said, pulling the woman to her feet. "We need to keep moving." They scrambled down the opposite side of the outcrop, their descent perilous but necessary. The cultists followed, their chants now a chaotic cacophony that seemed to reverberate through the very ground. The forest grew darker and denser, the trees so tightly packed they formed a nearly impenetrable wall. Alex pushed forward, his every muscle screaming in protest. He had no plan, only the primal drive to survive. Finally, they emerged into another clearing, this one eerily silent. In the center stood a crude wooden structure, half collapsed and overgrown with moss. Alex's eyes darted around, searching for signs of more cultists, but the area seemed abandoned. "We'll rest here," he said, his voice ragged. just for a moment." The woman nodded, sinking to the ground. Alex positioned himself near the edge of the clearing, his rifle ready. The silence was unnerving, but for now, it was their only reprieve. Alex scanned the edge of the clearing, his rifle steady, his eyes sweeping every shadow and movement. The cultists weren't far behind. He could feel it in the oppressive stillness that settled over the forest. Behind him, the woman sat slumped against the wooden structure, her breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. "We can't stay here long," Alex said, his voice low but firm. "If they catch up, we're out of options." "Who are these people?" she asked again, her voice tinged with fear. "Why are they doing this?" "I don't know," Alex replied, "but I know they're not going to stop." As if in response, the guttural chanting resumed in the distance, faint at first but growing louder. The sound sent a chill through Alex's body. It was rhythmic, primal, almost as if the forest itself were alive and joining in the pursuit. "They're coming," he muttered, rising to his feet. The woman struggled to stand, leaning heavily on him as they prepared to move. Alex led her toward the tree line, his mind racing. He needed to find a defensible position, somewhere they could hold their ground if necessary. But the forest was working against him. Its density and darkness made every step treacherous. The chanting grew louder, closer. Alex turned back and saw the first of the cultists emerging from the trees, their red robes stark against the shadowy backdrop. Their antlered masks gleamed like malevolent beacons, and their movements were disturbingly synchronized. "Run," Alex said, his voice sharp. They sprinted into the forest, the woman stumbling but keeping pace. Alex fired a shot over his shoulder, the muzzle flash illuminating the twisted faces of their pursuers. A cultist fell, but the others didn't slow. They moved with an unnatural determination, their chants filling the air like a hunting horn. The terrain grew steeper, the ground littered with roots and loose rocks. Alex's boots slipped as he helped the woman climb, their progress slow and arduous. Behind them, the cultists closed in, their chants now a frenzied cacophony. Alex reached the top of a ridge and turned, firing 2 more shots. Another cultist dropped, but the remaining figures were unfazed, their movements relentless. He spotted a narrow ravine ahead and motioned for the woman to follow. "Down here," he called, sliding down the rocky incline. They reached the bottom of the ravine, where a shallow stream trickled over smooth stones. The rushing water provided some cover, masking the sound of their movements. Alex guided the woman along the stream, the icy water soaking their boots. "Are they still behind us?" she asked, her voice trembling. Alex glanced back, his rifle at the ready. The cultists weren't visible, but the chanting continued, echoing through the ravine like a predator's growl. He nodded grimly. "They're not giving up." The stream led them to a narrow cave entrance, partially obscured by hanging vines. Alex pushed the foliage aside, revealing a dark tunnel that sloped downward. It wasn't ideal, but it was shelter. "In here," he said, motioning for her to enter. The woman hesitated, staring into the darkness. "Are you sure? We don't have a choice." She nodded and ducked inside, Alex following close behind. He crouched at the entrance, his rifle aimed at the ravine. The chanting grew fainter, but it didn't stop. He knew they wouldn't be safe for long. Inside the cave, the air was damp and cold. Alex lit a small flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom. The tunnel stretched deeper into the earth, its walls jagged and uneven. "This should buy us some time," he said, his voice low. "But we can't stay here forever." The woman sank to the ground, her hands trembling. Alex stayed at the entrance, listening. The cultists' chants echoed faintly, a reminder that the hunt wasn't over. The cave was deathly silent except for the faint drip of water echoing from somewhere deep within. Alex kept his rifle trained on the entrance, his finger hovering just above the trigger. The woman sat with her back against the rough stone wall, her breathing shallow but steady. The faint glow of Alex's flashlight cast long shadows, making the space feel more claustrophobic. "They won't stop," the woman whispered, her voice trembling. "Will they?" Alex shook his head. "Not until we're out of these woods." They waited, listening to the muffled chanting that ebbed and flowed outside. It felt distant now, but Alex knew better than to relax. He motioned for her to stand, handing her the flashlight. "We're moving," he said. "Stay close and keep quiet." The tunnel sloped downward, twisting and narrowing until they had to crouch to navigate through. The walls were slick with moisture, the air thick with the earthy scent of decay. As they descended deeper into the cave, the chanting faded completely, replaced by an oppressive silence. Finally, the tunnel opened into a wider cavern, its floor scattered with broken rocks and shallow pools of water. A faint light filtered through a jagged opening on the far side, an exit. Relief washed over Alex as he pointed toward it. "Looks like our way out," he said. They moved quickly, climbing over the uneven terrain toward the light. The fresh air was a welcome change from the cave's stale atmosphere. Alex pushed through the opening first, stepping into a narrow valley surrounded by towering cliffs. The forest loomed ahead, dense and uninviting, but he recognized a faint trail cutting through the undergrowth. "This leads somewhere," he said, helping the woman out of the cave. "We follow it until we find help." They moved cautiously, every sound in the forest amplified in the heavy silence. Alex's senses were on high alert, his rifle at the ready. The trail was overgrown but discernible, winding through the trees and gradually sloping upward. After what felt like hours, they reached the crest of a hill. Alex paused, scanning the area. In the distance, a thin plume of smoke rose above the treetops, a ranger station. Relief surged through him. "That's our way out," he said, pointing toward the smoke. "We're close." The woman nodded, her expression a mix of exhaustion and hope. They descended the hill, the trail becoming more defined as they neared the station. For the first time since the ordeal began, Alex felt a glimmer of hope. When they finally reached the station, it was nearly dusk. The small wooden building stood at the edge of a clearing, its windows glowing faintly with warm light. Alex approached cautiously, knocking on the door with the butt of his rifle. A park ranger opened the door, his expression turning to concern as he took in their disheveled appearance. "What happened to you two?" he asked. Alex glanced at the woman, then back at the ranger. "We need to report something. There's a group in the woods, dangerous people." The ranger nodded, ushering them inside. "Let's get you both some water and call the authorities." Inside, the warmth of the station was comforting. Alex and the woman recounted their story as the ranger listened intently, his face growing more serious with each detail. He radioed for backup, assuring them help was on the way. For the first time in hours, Alex allowed himself to relax. They were safe. At least he thought they were. The ranger station was a haven of normalcy compared to the horrors Alex and the woman had just endured. Warm light spilled from the ceiling lamp, illuminating the wooden walls adorned with maps and safety guidelines. Alex sat stiffly in a chair, his rifle resting against the table, while the woman sipped from a steaming mug of tea. The ranger hovered nearby, jotting notes as they recounted their ordeal. "You're saying there's a group of people out there wearing robes and antlers?" the ranger asked, his brow furrowed. "Performing some kind of ritual?" "Yes," Alex said firmly. "They were armed, organized, and dangerous. They were going to kill her." He nodded toward the woman, who clutched the mug with trembling hands. The ranger hesitated, his pen hovering above his notepad. "I've heard stories about strange things in these woods, but this..." He shook his head. "I'll radio this in and get a search team out there. We'll find them." Alex exhaled, tension he hadn't realized he was holding finally easing. He leaned back in his chair, exhaustion settling over him like a heavy blanket. They were finally safe. Help was coming. But then the woman gasped, dropping her mug. The ceramic shattered on the floor as she stared at her forearm, her eyes wide with terror. "What is it?" Alex asked, immediately on alert. She held up her arm, revealing a small but intricate tattoo etched into her skin, a circular symbol eerily similar to the ones carved into the trees and stone altars. Alex's stomach twisted as he rolled up his own sleeve. His blood ran cold. There it was. The same symbol, faint but unmistakable, burned into his skin just above his wrist. "No," Alex muttered, his mind racing. "This wasn't here before." The woman's breathing grew rapid, panic overtaking her. What does it mean? What did they do to us? The ranger stepped closer, his face a mask of confusion. Are you saying these markings just appeared? Alex nodded, his jaw tight. His instincts, honed over years of survival, screamed that this was no coincidence. The cult had marked them, though he didn't know how or why. The radio on the ranger's desk crackled to life, a garbled voice announcing the arrival of backup. The ranger reached for the device, but Alex's attention was fixed on the tattoo. He traced it with his finger, the symbol's meaning eluding him but filling him with a deep, unshakable dread. This isn't over, he said, his voice low and resolute. The woman looked at him, her eyes filled with fear. What do we do now? Alex didn't have an answer. The cultist's chants echoed faintly in his memory, a sinister reminder of what they'd escaped, but perhaps not entirely. We stay alive, Alex said finally, and we figure out what this means. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the faint rustle of the forest. Somewhere, deep in the Appalachian wilderness, the cultists were still out there, waiting, watching. Alex gripped his rifle tighter, his resolve hardening. The hunt wasn't over, not for them and not for him. I bought Ouija board from the dark web. Yeah, the title is definitely weird. I know, but hear me out. I will not say that what I did was okay and good on my part. But I was bored. Boredom is scary. I am 22 years old guy. Not a lot of friends. Still going to college. My name is Oliver. I never believed in the supernatural, or you can call it the paranormal if you want. Ghost stories, demon stories, spirits, and stuff like that, I did not believe in any. One day I was playing games on my computer and I got bored doing that. It was late at night, about 2 a.m. I decided to check out the dark web for the first time in my life. I have heard the stories about the dark web. You know about all the legal and not so legal stuff that is happening. If I say I wasn't curious, I would lie. I have considered going on the dark web before, but it was never the right time, or like I didn't have the courage. So, I knew a little bit about how to access the dark web, I knew about the Tor browser, and I knew my ways with the computer. So I downloaded it with no problems. Then, just for safety reasons, I turned on my VPN as well. I disconnected the webcam and even my microphone, just to be as safe as possible. So there were all these links that I had no clue what they were. So I did the easiest thing someone could do. Click randomly on links. Maybe not the smartest move, I know, but definitely the easiest one. So I was just clicking around and it was all boring stuff. I was 30 minutes in, and it was just boring texts and maybe a disturbing picture occasionally, but nothing more. At this point, I thought all the stories were fake. I thought the stories were just stories made by people trying to sound cool or badass. That is when I stumbled upon this weird website. It was selling Ouija boards. I do not believe in the supernatural or the paranormal, like I said. So why did this website and the stuff they were selling grabbed my attention so much? The price was not big to order a Ouija board. It was something I could afford. I decided to throw my money away. They wanted the payment to be in Bitcoin, so I paid in Bitcoin. I know what that is, and I own Bitcoin as well. I did not put my address down, of course. There was an abandoned place no one goes to near my college, so I wrote that address. They said strictly in 3 days the product will be on the address. After ordering it, I saw that this website was selling more than just boards. They were also selling items for some weird rituals. I will not talk about those items because they were gross. After seeing that, I just turned off the page in the Tor browser and just said to myself, enough for one night. And I went to sleep. I will now fast forward 3 days. So, it was Sunday when I ordered my product and now it is Wednesday. So, after college was finished for the day, I went to check the abandoned place for my package. I started looking around, but there was nothing, or was there? Behind a brick, I saw something like a box. I went to check it out, and yes, it was for me. It was here. I picked it up and I went straight home. I opened the box in my room, and yes, it was just an ordinary Ouija board. Wow, I said to myself. I really paid a lot for this piece of wood. Really scary. Before we continue with the story, I just want to mention I live alone. No family with me or roommates. So I decided to play the Ouija board. I placed it on the ground and took the planchette out of the box as well. I also lit 3 candles as well. They were just for the vibe, so do not ask me why exactly 3 candles. That is how many I found. So I placed the planchette on the board and I asked a question. Are there any spurts, ghosts here? And that is when the unexpected happened. Do you know what happened? Nothing. I asked another question. Again, nothing. Can you believe that? It is like Ouija boards do not work. So, after that, I was done. I put the Ouija board in the corner of my room, fired up my computer and started playing games to pass the time. After a few long hours, it was getting late, so it was time for me to go to bed. I went to bed normally, like every night. And then in the middle of the night, I woke up in a place I did not recognize. At first, I thought it was a dream, but no, it was not. I was just lying in the middle of a big empty building. I was more confused than scared, to be honest. I got up and started looking around, but it was empty. I yelled, "Is anyone here?" But nothing. Silence. I started walking around looking for the exit. It was a bright night, so it was not that dark. The building had no roof. That was weird. Eventually, I found the exit, so I needed to walk in my sleeping clothes through town to get to my apartment. I didn't even have shoes. So I walked back to my place, and the door was open. I mean the front door. I entered slowly and looking around to see if someone is in there, but no one was inside. What happened was weird, but after washing my hands and feet, I went to bed again. The next morning when I woke up, everything was like it was. Nothing weird. I went to college. I had classes. When they were done, I came home, fired up my computer again, started gaming. The time passed and it was time to go to bed again. I started to have dreams about the abandoned place where I woke up the other night. I saw a name inside. It started with the letter O, but the next 3 or 4 letters were blurry. But the second word was clear. It said facility. In the dream, I also saw people running away from something. At least that is how it looked like. The next morning when I woke up, I remembered the dream. I was thinking it was weird, but I didn't really pay too much attention. But I was curious. So I got dressed, and today I skipped collage. I went to the abandoned place, started looking around if I will find the name of that facility, but nothing was there. I started asking the people around if they knew any facilities or something like that in the area. I got the same answer, no matter who I asked. Their answer was no, there is nothing like that here. There is nothing like that now, and there wasn't anything like that in the past. I started searching on Google for any facilities in the area, but no results. I tried to search on the dark web also, no results. I said to myself, I must be overthinking this. I went to the closest restaurant to get something to eat. I ate, then I grabbed a coffee and went home to play games. The day passed fast and it was time for bed again. I left all the lights in my apartment because going to sleep was kind of creepy now. I went to sleep and at one point I woke up. I was again in the same abandoned place. I was scared now, like totally scared. I got up fast and started running towards the exit. I went to my apartment and the front door was opened again. I just put on the jacket that was close to the door and put on my shoes and went to a place where I can just sit with people around me. It was around 4 a.m. I went to bed around midnight. I was thinking what I can do. Then I remembered the Ouija board that was still in my room. On the internet, I watched guides on how to get rid of an Ouija board and Ouija board connection. They said I need to burn it. But before I did that, I decided to take a risk. So after the sun raised and the shops opened, I went to buy a few cameras for my apartment. One for my room, one for the small corridor to the front door, and one more for the kitchen near the corridor leading to the front door. I wanted to put them in a way if I ever leave the apartment while sleeping, I will be able to see it on the security cameras. I called people to put them in my apartment, and I even bought a security alarm. If you are asking how I have this kind of money to spend, that is because I make money playing games. So the people working on the cameras and the security alarm were done around 5 p.m. I decided to go outside until it was time to bed. I sat in the same coffee place and spent 7 hours there. It was midnight now and it was time for me to take the risk. I went to my apartment and before going to bed I made sure the alarm was on and that the cameras are working properly. I went to bed finally. It was hard to fall asleep, but somehow I managed to fall asleep. Then around 4 a.m. I woke up again. I was again here in the empty abandoned building. But this time was different. The air around me was different. The atmosphere was different. It was like someone or something is breathing in my neck. I stared, looking around, but there was nothing around me. Or no one, to be more specific. Then I heard a loud scream and like a metal pipe bang sound. I started running towards the exit. I managed to get out. I was in shock and scared. I went to the same coffee place to wait for the sun to show. While waiting there, I was thinking, what the hell was that? What the hell just happened? I was even shaking a little bit. The woman who worked there asked me if I am okay, and if something happened. I just said, yay, everything is okay. I mean, I couldn't tell her that I am having problems with ghosts or something. So, it was finally around 7 in the morning, and I went to check out the cameras. When I saw the footage, I was terrified. On the footage, you can clearly see me leaving the apartment. The scary part is that my arm was outstretched in front of me, but it was like someone is pulling me. You know, like when you are holding someone's hand, and you are pulling them to come with you in the direction you want to go. Yay, this was the same. I didn't waste any time. I burned the Ouija board. I called the owner of the apartment, and I told him I am leaving this place. I took all of my stuff, left the apartment and even left the town, found another college in another town. And I am staying away from anything dangerous or spiritual since that day. And yes, I am sleeping okay now. Thanks for listening to this story that even I don't believe while writing it. If you believe me or not is up to you. I know one thing for sure, and that is that you don't mess around with stuff you don't understand and you cannot control. I really hope there is no next time, but until then, see you and have a good day. And stay away from the dark web and spiritual boards and games. Hey everyone, I need to share something that's been happening to me. It all started a few months ago when I got into the dark web. Yeah, I know, not the best idea, but my curiosity got the better of me. I was just browsing through some forums about unsolved mysteries and puzzles, nothing too crazy. One night I found this weird post. It was called Unlocking the Secrets of the Universe. It didn't have any replies or upvotes. Honestly, it looked like no one had even seen it. But something about it caught my eye. The post had a link to a hidden dark website and a warning that said, "Only the brave or the foolish should proceed. The answers you seek come at a price." Of course, I clicked the link. The page was super plain, just a black background with some weird text I couldn't read, and a download link called Ancient Alien Texts. I hesitated for a bit, but then I downloaded the file. It took forever to decrypt, and when I finally opened it, I saw pages filled with strange symbols and diagrams. They were like nothing I'd ever seen before. I became obsessed with these texts. I spent days and nights trying to figure them out. The more I looked, the more I felt like these symbols were instructions. Maybe even a guide to understanding the universe, our existence, and stuff like space and time travel. It was mind-blowing, and I couldn't stop. But then things started to get weird. At first, it was just this creepy feeling like someone was watching me. I'd see shadows out of the corner of my eye, but when I looked, there was nothing there. Then it got worse. I'd wake up and find my computer messed with, files moved or deleted. I started getting these freaky emails telling me to stop what I was doing. The emails were weird and scary. One said, "You're meddling with forces beyond your understanding." Another just said, "They are coming for you." I tried to ignore them, thinking it was just some troll trying to mess with me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was really wrong. One night, while I was deep into my research, I heard a noise outside my apartment. It sounded like someone trying to get in. My heart was pounding. I grabbed a kitchen knife and went to the door. I looked through the peephole but didn't see anything. Just when I was about to turn away, there was a loud bang and the sound of footsteps running away. I opened the door and looked down the hallway, but no one was there. My heart was racing. I knew then that this wasn't just a prank. Someone was really trying to scare me, or worse, stop me from what I was doing. The next few days were a nightmare. I felt like I was constantly being watched. I'd see people in dark clothes standing across the street from my apartment, just staring. Every time I tried to get close, they'd vanish. I started getting paranoid. I barely slept and jumped at every little noise. My friends and family noticed I was acting strange, but I couldn't tell them the truth. How could I explain that I was being hunted because I found something incredible? Something that could change everything? One night I was packing up my stuff to move to a safer place when I got another message. It was a video file showing footage of my apartment building. The timestamp was from that very moment. The camera zoomed in on my window, and then the screen went black. A voice whispered, "Run, Alex, run while you still can." I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my bag and ran out of my apartment. I didn't even lock the door. As I ran through the empty streets, I could feel eyes on me, watching. Whoever they were close, and they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted or I was gone. I don't know what I've gotten myself into, but I can't stop now. The ancient alien texts might hold the key to everything, but they're also a curse. I'm not just a researcher anymore, I'm on the run. I have to keep moving, keep hiding, and keep looking for answers. The fate of the universe might depend on it. I managed to find a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, but at least I felt a bit safer for the moment. I needed to figure out my next move, but my mind was racing. I knew I had to keep working on the ancient texts, but I also needed to stay hidden. Easier said than done. After a restless night, I decided to head to a public library. It felt safer to be around people, and I could use their computers to keep researching. I couldn't risk using my laptop and getting tracked. The library was quiet, a perfect place to think. As I sat there, buried in books and online forums, I noticed a man in a dark hoodie lingering near the entrance. He seemed out of place, glancing around nervously. My gut told me he was watching me. I tried to stay calm and focused on my work, but it was hard with the constant fear gnawing at me. The texts were starting to make more sense. I found patterns in the symbols that matched ancient languages and mathematical formulas. It was like piecing together a cosmic puzzle. I was getting closer to something big, something that could change everything we know about the universe. But the more progress I made, the more I felt eyes on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every time I left the library, I'd take different routes back to the motel, hoping to throw off anyone who might be tailing me. Sometimes I'd duck into shops or cafes just to make sure no one was on my trail. One evening, as I was walking back, I noticed a black SUV parked across the street from the motel. It looked suspicious, and I could see two figures inside. They didn't look like regular people just hanging out. My heart started pounding. I knew I couldn't go back there. I ducked into an alley and took a different route, eventually finding another motel a few miles away. I paid in cash and used a fake name. I was getting good at this running and hiding thing, but it was exhausting. In my new hideout, I continued working on the texts. I started to uncover information about ancient alien civilizations, their advanced technology, and how they might have influenced early human cultures. The texts hinted at the possibility of unlocking space and time travel, just like I suspected. But there were also warnings about the dangers of this knowledge, about entities that would stop at nothing to keep these secrets hidden. Late one night, as I was deep into decoding another section, I heard a knock on the door. My blood ran cold. I grabbed my knife and moved silently to the peephole. It was the motel manager, a nervous-looking man who seemed on edge. "Is everything all right?" I asked through the door, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's someone here to see you," he said, his voice shaky. "They said it's urgent." I knew this was bad. I quickly gathered my things and climbed out of the window, dropping down into the alley behind the motel. As I ran, I heard voices shouting and doors slamming. They were getting closer. I made my way to a nearby bus station and bought a ticket to the next town over. I needed to keep moving, to stay one step ahead. On the bus, I tried to blend in, keeping my head down and my hoodie up. The other passengers looked like ordinary people, but I couldn't trust anyone. Everywhere I went, I felt the weight of unseen eyes. The texts were my only hope, but they were also the reason I was being hunted. I had to find a way to finish decoding them, to unlock their secrets before it was too late. The journey was far from over, and the stakes were higher than ever. I was in too deep to turn back now. Whatever lay ahead, I had to keep going. The fate of the universe might depend on it, and I couldn't let fear stop me. As the bus rolled into the next town, I took a deep breath and prepared for the next leg of my journey. I was running out of places to hide, but I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. All right, so here's what happened next. After getting to the new town and finding a cheap motel, I felt a bit safer, at least for the moment. I was still paranoid, but I had to keep going. I needed to keep working on those ancient texts and stay hidden. The next morning, I went to a public library to use their computer. It felt safer than using mine since I didn't want to be tracked. While I was checking my emails, I saw one from someone named Watcher. The subject line was, "I can help you." My heart was pounding as I opened it. The email said, "Alex, I know you're in danger. I've been following your work on the ancient alien texts. I can help you run and hide. I also have information that can help you solve the puzzle. Meet me at the old warehouse on 5th Street at midnight. Come alone. Watcher." I didn't know if I could trust this guy, but I was desperate. Maybe he really could help me solve the puzzle and stay safe. I decided to take the risk, but I had to be careful in case it was a trap. As midnight approached, I went to the old warehouse. The place was creepy and abandoned, just what you'd expect. I slipped inside, my knife in my jacket pocket, and looked around. "Watcher?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. A guy stepped out of the shadows. He was tall, wearing a hood that covered most of his face. "I'm here to help you, Alex," he said. His voice was calm and made me feel a bit more at ease. "I know what you're dealing with. They're after you because you found something important." "How do I know I can trust you?" I asked, still keeping my distance. "You don't," he said, shrugging. "But I have information that can help you solve the puzzle. I've been studying these texts for years." He showed me a small notebook filled with notes and diagrams similar to what I'd been working on. It looked legit. For a moment, I thought maybe he could actually help me. We started talking about the symbols and patterns in the text. He pointed out some connections I hadn't noticed before. I was starting to feel hopeful. Maybe I wasn't alone in this after all. Then I noticed something off. Watcher kept glancing towards the door like he was expecting someone. My gut told me something was wrong. Suddenly, the door burst open and a bunch of guys in dark suits stormed in, guns drawn. I realized too late that it was a trap. "Hands up, Alex," one of them shouted. "You're coming with us." I turned to Watcher, feeling betrayed and angry. "You set me up," I yelled. "I'm sorry, Alex," he said, his voice cold now. "But you're a threat to them, and to me." I had no choice but to run. I bolted towards a back exit, my heart pounding. Bullets whizzed past me as I ran through the dark corridors of the warehouse. I could hear them getting closer. I found a side door and burst out into an alley. I kept running, not daring to look back. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like they were on fire, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving. After what felt like hours, I finally found a small hidden spot, behind some dumpsters. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. My mind was racing. I couldn't believe I had been so stupid to trust a stranger from the dark web. I knew now that I couldn't trust anyone. The texts were my only hope, but they were also my curse. Whoever was after me was powerful, and they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted, or I was dead. I pulled out my phone and looked at the texts one more time. I had to finish decoding them. I had to find the answers before they found me. The stakes were higher than ever, and I was running out of time. As I sat there, hiding in the dark, I vowed to keep fighting. No matter what it took, I would uncover the truth. And maybe, just maybe, I'd find a way to stay alive long enough to do it. After that close call at the warehouse, I knew I needed a place where no one would find me. I remembered hearing about an old abandoned mine outside of town. It seemed perfect, remote and off the radar. So I decided to head there. It took me a few hours, but I finally reached the mine. It was as creepy as you'd imagine, but I didn't have much choice. I squeezed through a small entrance and found a hidden spot deep inside. The air was damp and cold, and the only light I had was from my phone's flashlight. It wasn't comfortable, but it felt safe. I set up a little camp with some old blankets I found lying around. I was exhausted, but I couldn't rest yet. I had to keep working on those ancient texts. With my laptop and the texts spread out in front of me, I got to work. The silence of the mine was both creepy and kind of nice. It let me focus on the symbols and diagrams without any distractions. As I worked, I started to see connections I hadn't noticed before. The texts talked about advanced technology, stuff way beyond what we have now. They mentioned things like manipulating space and time, and even hinted at other dimensions. Days passed by in a blur. I barely slept and lived off the few supplies I had with me. The more I worked, the closer I felt to a breakthrough. I was deep into the texts, piecing together what seemed like instructions for some kind of device. Then, one night, I heard something. Footsteps. They echoed through the mine, getting closer. My heart stopped. Had they found me? I quickly turned off my flashlight and held my breath. The footsteps got louder and then stopped right outside my hiding spot. I could see a faint light like from another flashlight. I grabbed my knife, ready to defend myself. The light moved away and the footsteps faded. I let out a shaky breath. That was way too close. I knew they were closing in on me, and I had to be even more careful. I went back to the texts, working faster now. I had to finish this before they caught me. I decoded another section that described a device that could open a portal through space and time. It sounded like something out of a sci-fi movie, but the texts were incredibly detailed. If this thing was real, it could change everything. I started drawing diagrams and making notes, trying to figure out how to build it. It was complicated, but I felt like I was making progress. The more I understood, the more I realized how dangerous this knowledge was. No wonder they were after me. If this got into the wrong hands, it could be a disaster. I knew I had to keep moving and keep hiding, but I was also close to something big. I just had to stay one step ahead of them and finish decoding the texts. My only hope was to unlock the secrets before they found me. Sitting there in the dark, cold mine, I felt a mix of fear and determination. I was in way over my head, but I couldn't stop now. The fate of everything might depend on it. So I woke up in the mine with the worst headache ever. I had no idea what happened. I looked around and saw my laptop and those weird ancient texts scattered everywhere. I guess I must have fallen and hit my head on a rock. My memory was a mess. I couldn't remember anything. I tried to make sense of everything, the symbols, the texts. All of it seemed familiar, but it was like I was seeing it for the first time. Then I found my notes and some posts I had written online. That's when things started to get really strange. According to my notes, I had been researching these ancient alien texts. I was obsessed with them, trying to decode them and figure out what they meant. I even wrote about being chased and hiding in this mine, but I couldn't remember any of it. Reading my own words was weird. It felt like I was reading someone else's story. The texts talked about advanced technology, space travel, time travel, and other dimensions. It sounded like science fiction, but I had taken it seriously. I tried to remember more, but my mind was blank. The fall must have wiped my memory. All I had were my notes and these strange texts that still didn't make much sense to me. I knew they were important, but I couldn't remember why or how. I spent hours going through everything, trying to piece it together. Little bits started to come back. I remembered thinking the text could unlock secrets about the universe, maybe even time travel. But every time I felt close to remembering, it slipped away. I realized I needed to get out of the mine and find help. Maybe someone could help me recover my memories, or at least understand the texts. But I was scared. What if the people who were after me were still out there? I packed up my stuff and slowly made my way out of the mine. The sunlight was blinding after being in the dark for so long. I felt weak and disoriented, but I had to keep moving. As I walked towards the nearest town, I thought about everything I had read in my notes. Even though I couldn't remember much, I knew I had found something huge, something that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. And now, with my memories gone, I was the only one who could figure it out again. I decided to keep a low profile and stay off the grid as much as possible. I needed to find a safe place to stay and then work on getting my memories back. Maybe I could finish what I started. For now, all I have are my notes, these strange texts, and a feeling that the truth is just out of reach. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I can't let this mystery stay buried. I have to uncover the secrets of the ancient alien texts, no matter what it takes. Hey everyone, I don't usually post stuff like this, but I feel like I have to tell someone. If anything happens to me, people need to know what's going on. This is how I found out why people were disappearing in the forest near my town and why a weird group called Lumini is now after me. A few months ago, things started getting really strange in my small town. We're surrounded by this big, creepy forest, and people just started vanishing. It began with a hiker who didn't come back, then a couple of teens, and eventually even some locals who knew the forest really well. The cops tried their best, but they couldn't find any clues. Search parties went into the forest but came back with nothing. It was like the forest had just swallowed these people up. Everyone in town started talking. Some said it was a wild animal, others thought it might be a serial killer, but the scariest idea was that something supernatural was at work. I don't usually believe in ghosts or monsters, but I was curious. I wanted to figure out what was happening. I'm not a detective or anything, but I thought maybe I could find something everyone else missed. So I started talking to the families of the missing people. Most of them were too upset to say much, but a few mentioned weird things that happened before their loved ones disappeared. One woman, Mrs. Thompson, told me about her son, David. She said he'd been acting strange for weeks, talking about weird lights in the forest and hearing whispers at night. The night he went missing, she heard him talking to someone, but when she checked, he was gone, and the front door was wide open. Armed with this info, I decided to check out the forest myself. I packed a bag with some supplies, a flashlight, a knife, some food, and a notebook to write down anything weird. I set out early in the morning, hoping to cover a lot of ground. The forest was super quiet, no birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. I followed the main trail for a while, then went off into the thicker parts of the woods. Hours went by without anything happening, but I kept feeling like someone was watching me. I told myself it was just my imagination and kept going. Around midday, I found an old abandoned cabin. It was hidden behind thick bushes, almost like someone didn't want it to be found. The door was slightly open, and I felt a chill go down my spine. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The cabin was dark and smelled like wet wood. I turned on my flashlight and started looking around. There were old, broken pieces of furniture scattered everywhere and strange symbols carved into the walls. In the corner, I found a trapdoor. My heart was pounding as I opened it and saw a set of stairs leading down into darkness. I hesitated for a moment, but then decided to go down. The air got colder with each step, and the silence was creepy. At the bottom, I found a small, dimly lit room. The walls were covered in more of those weird symbols, and in the center of the room was a large stone table. On it lay a book that looked like it was bound in human skin. I walked up to the table, feeling a mix of fear and curiosity. The book was open, and the pages were filled with handwritten notes and drawings. It was a journal, talking about rituals and sacrifices. My hands were shaking as I read about the forest guardians, ancient beings that needed human sacrifices to stay asleep. The missing people hadn't just vanished. They had been taken. I took photos of the journal and the symbols, then quickly went back up the stairs. I needed to get out of there and tell someone. As I reached the top, I heard a noise outside. I peeked through a crack in the door and saw 3 men dressed in black, carrying strange glowing devices. They moved around like they were looking for something. I held my breath, waiting for them to leave. Eventually they did, but I knew I couldn't stay in the forest. I ran back to town, not stopping until I got to my house. I locked all the doors and windows, my mind racing. Who were those men? How were they connected to the disappearances? I spent the next few days searching online, trying to find out more about the symbols and the forest guardians. My search led me to the dark web, a place I had always avoided. I found forums and chat rooms talking about similar disappearances and strange rituals. One name kept coming up: Lumini. Lumini, according to the posts, was an old organization dedicated to protecting the forest guardians. They were ruthless, getting rid of anyone who found out their secrets. The more I read, the more scared I got. I had stumbled onto something far bigger and more dangerous than I ever imagined. I knew I had to share what I found, but I couldn't go to the police. They wouldn't believe me, and even if they did, they wouldn't be able to stop Lumini. So I posted everything online, hoping someone would notice and do something. That's when the messages started. Anonymous emails and texts telling me to stop. At first I ignored them, but then I noticed people following me. Dark cars parked outside my house, strange figures in the corner of my vision. I was being hunted. I'm writing this now as a warning. If you're reading this, be careful. They're everywhere, and they're watching. I don't know how much time I have left, but I needed to get this out. The disappearances, the rituals, Lumini, they're real, and they're more dangerous than you can imagine. So, after I put my findings online, things got even crazier. I thought I was done, but I was wrong. It started with little things. I'd notice people hanging around my house like they were watching me. I'd get these weird phone calls where no one would say anything, just heavy breathing. I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe I was just being paranoid, but it was hard to ignore. One night I was home alone watching TV. It was late and I heard a noise outside. At first I thought it was just a raccoon or something, but then I saw a shadow move past my window. I grabbed my flashlight and went to check it out. When I opened the door, there was no one there, but I found a note on my doorstep. It said, "Stop looking, or you'll disappear too." I was freaked out. I called the police, but when they arrived, the note was gone. They looked around and didn't find anything. I tried to explain what was happening, but I could tell they didn't believe me. They said it was probably just a prank and left. I knew it wasn't a prank. The next few days were a blur. I barely slept, constantly looking over my shoulder. Then one evening I decided to go to my friend Mike's place. Mike and I have known each other since high school, and he's one of the few people I trust. When I got to Mike's, I told him everything. He listened and didn't interrupt, which I appreciated. After I finished, he looked at me seriously and said, "You need to lay low for a while. Stay here. We'll figure this out." I agreed, and for the first time in days, I felt a little safer. Mike set up a spare room for me and I crashed hard. The next morning we started brainstorming what to do next. Mike suggested we try to find out more about Lumini, maybe even try to find other people who had encountered them. We spent hours digging through forums and old news articles. We found a few more stories similar to mine. People who had discovered something they weren't supposed to and then vanished. It was unsettling, but it also confirmed that I wasn't alone in this. One of the stories we found was about a guy named Tom who had been researching strange symbols he found in the woods near his home. His posts stopped abruptly a few years ago, and there was no trace of him after that. It was like he just disappeared off the face of the earth. We also found mentions of a journalist who had been looking into Lumini. She had written a series of articles about secret societies and mysterious disappearances. Her last article hinted that she was close to uncovering something big, but she never published anything after that. I tried to find out what happened to her, but it was like she had vanished too. The more we looked, the clearer it became that Lumini was real and very dangerous. Mike suggested we reach out to some of the people who had posted about their experiences. Maybe they knew more or had some advice on what to do next. I was hesitant at first, but I agreed. We sent out a few messages, and within a couple of hours we got a reply from someone named Mass Monster. Mass Monster claimed to have had a close encounter with Lumini and offered to meet us in person. We set up a meeting at a diner a few towns over for the next day. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing noises outside Mike's house, but every time I looked, there was nothing there. I knew I was being paranoid, but I couldn't help it. The next morning, Mike and I drove to the diner. We got there early and took a booth in the back where we could see the entrance. A few minutes later, a man walked in and headed straight for us. He was in his mid-40s, with a scruffy beard and tired eyes. He introduced himself as Mass Monster and sat down. He was nervous, constantly glancing around like he expected someone to jump out at any moment. Mass Monster told us that he used to be part of Lumini. He had joined them years ago, thinking they were just another secret society with strange rituals. But he soon realized they were much more sinister. He told us about the forest guardians and the sacrifices. He said that Lumini would do anything to keep their secrets, including eliminating anyone who got too close to the truth. I asked him why he left, and he looked me in the eye and said, "I couldn't live with myself. I couldn't keep helping them take innocent lives." He had been on the run ever since, constantly moving and hiding. Mass Monster warned us that we were in serious danger. Lumini didn't take kindly to outsiders poking around in their business. He gave us some advice on how to stay off their radar, change our routines, use cash instead of cards, and avoid any place we could be easily tracked. Before we left, he handed us a burner phone. "If you need to contact me, use this. But be careful. They have eyes everywhere." Then he slipped out of the diner, disappearing into the crowd. Mike and I drove back to his place in silence, both of us processing everything we had just learned. It was clear that we were in way over our heads. But now, we had a better understanding of what we were up against. When we got back, we started making plans. We decided to follow Mass Monster's advice and lay low for a while. We'd keep researching, but we'd be extra careful. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I don't know what's going to happen next. I'm scared, but I also know that I can't just ignore this. Too many people have disappeared, and I have to do something, even if it means risking my life. After meeting with Mass Monster and laying low at Mike's place, we kept digging for more information. One night we found an old forum post about a guy named Josh who disappeared in the same forest but came back. His story was different from the others, and we hoped he might have some answers. We found his last known address and decided to check it out. When we got there, the place looked abandoned. The windows were boarded up, and it had an eerie vibe. We knocked, but no one answered. We were about to leave when an old neighbor came by and told us that Josh had died a few months after he returned. He didn't say how, just that it was sudden and unexpected. I felt like we had hit a dead end, but Mike suggested something crazy. He said we should try to contact Josh through a spirit board, a Ouija board. I thought he was joking at first, but he was dead serious. He said it was worth a shot since we had no other leads. I wasn't sure about it. I mean, talking to the dead? But Mike was convinced, and honestly, I was desperate. We went to a local shop that sold occult stuff and bought a Ouija board. That night, we set it up in Mike's living room. We turned off all the lights, lit some candles, and sat across from each other with the board between us. Mike explained how it worked. We placed our fingers on the planchette, the little piece you move around the board, and started asking questions. At first, nothing happened. We asked, "Is anyone there?" Over and over. Then the planchette started to move. Slowly at first, then more confidently. It spelled out, "Yes." I felt a chill run down my spine. Mike asked, "Who are we talking to?" The planchette moved again, spelling out, "Josh." My heart was racing. I asked, "Josh, did you disappear in the forest?" "Yes," it spelled out. "Can you tell us what happened to you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The planchette moved slowly, spelling out words one by one. Taken, ritual, escaped. We were both leaning in now, totally focused. "Josh, how did you escape?" Mike asked. The planchette spelled out, "Helped by spirits." I couldn't believe what I was seeing. "Why did you come back?" I asked. "To warn," it spelled out. "Lumini will stop at nothing." I felt a lump in my throat. "What can we do to stop them?" I asked. The planchette paused, then spelled out, "Break the ritual." We asked how to do that, but the connection started to fade. The planchette moved slower and spelled out, "Find the altar," before it stopped completely. We tried to ask more questions, but it was like Josh was gone. We sat back, taking in what had just happened. We had a new lead. We needed to find the altar in the forest where the rituals were being done. It was the only way to stop Lumini, and maybe save anyone else who might disappear. The next day, we prepared to go back into the forest. We packed our bags with supplies, flashlights, food, water, and anything else we thought we might need. We knew it was going to be dangerous, but we didn't have a choice. This was our only shot at stopping Lumini and ending the disappearances for good. Before we left, we checked the burner phone Mass Monster had given us. There was a new message: "Be careful. They're watching." It didn't say who it was from, but we knew it had to be Watcher. It was a reminder that we needed to stay alert. We headed into the forest, retracing our steps to the old cabin where I had found the journal. It took us most of the day to get there, but we finally arrived just as the sun was setting. The cabin looked even creepier in the fading light. We made our way inside and down to the basement, where I had found the altar. We started looking for any clues that might help us break the ritual. The air was cold and still, and the silence was unnerving. We searched every inch of the room, but nothing seemed to stand out. Then, Mike noticed something. One of the symbols on the wall was slightly different from the others. It was a small detail, but it was enough to catch his eye. We focused on that symbol, trying to figure out what it meant. As we did, the room seemed to get even colder, and the candles flickered. It felt like we were being watched. Suddenly, we heard a noise upstairs. Footsteps. Someone was in the cabin. We quickly hid, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The footsteps got closer, then stopped. We held our breath, waiting. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away, and we heard the front door close. We waited a few more minutes before coming out of hiding. We knew we didn't have much time. Whoever had been there might come back. We took photos of the symbol and anything else that seemed important, then made our way back out of the cabin and into the forest. We decided to head back to Mike's place to figure out our next move. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. We made it back to Mike's without any trouble, but I knew we weren't safe yet. Lumini was out there, and they knew we were getting closer to the truth. We spent the next few days analyzing the photos and trying to decode the symbol. It was slow going, but we started to make some progress. We realized that the symbol was part of a larger pattern, something that connected all the rituals. It was a map, showing the locations of the altars in the forest. With this new information, we knew what we had to do. We needed to find all the altars and destroy them. It was the only way to break the ritual and stop Lumini. It wasn't going to be easy, but we were determined. After figuring out that the symbols formed a map of the altars, we knew we had to find and destroy them to stop Lumini. We didn't have much time. We packed our bags again, making sure we had everything we needed: flashlights, a crowbar, food, water, and the burner phone. We decided to start with the closest altar. The map was pretty detailed, so we had a good idea of where to go. We set out early in the morning, hoping to cover as much ground as possible before nightfall. The forest felt even more sinister this time. Every sound made us jump, and the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. We followed the map, and after a few hours of hiking, we reached the first altar. It was hidden in a small clearing, surrounded by thick trees. The altar itself was a stone slab covered in the same strange symbols we had seen before. We wasted no time. Mike used the crowbar to break the stone slab while I kept watch. The moment he struck the altar, the air around us seemed to change. It was like the forest itself was reacting to what we were doing. After several hard hits, the altar cracked and crumbled. We took photos of the broken altar as proof and quickly moved on to the next location. The second and third altars were similar to the first. Each time we destroyed one, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. It felt like we were being hunted, but we couldn't stop. We took short breaks to eat and drink, but we knew we had to keep moving. By the time we reached the fourth altar, it was getting dark. This one was different. It was larger and more elaborate, almost like it was the main altar. We were exhausted, but we knew this one was important. As Mike raised the crowbar to strike, we heard voices in the distance. Someone was coming. We hid behind some bushes and watched as a group of men dressed in black approached the altar. They had flashlights and were speaking in hushed tones. It was clear they were part of Lumini. We had to wait until they left, but we couldn't risk being seen. After what felt like hours, the men finally left. We waited a bit longer to make sure they were gone, then approached the altar again. Mike swung the crowbar with all his strength, and the stone shattered. As it did, we felt a rush of cold air, and the forest went silent. We took photos and quickly made our way back to Mike's house. Back at Mike's place, we reviewed the photos and tried to figure out our next move. We knew Lumini would be furious when they discovered the altars had been destroyed. We needed to stay hidden and figure out a way to protect ourselves. That night, we received a message on the burner phone. "You're in over your heads. Stop now, or face the consequences." It was clear Lumini knew what we had done. We knew we couldn't stop now. Too many people had disappeared, and we were close to ending it for good. We spent the next few days preparing for the worst. We fortified Mike's house as best we could, making sure we had enough supplies to last a while. We also reached out to Mass Monster, hoping he might have some advice. He responded quickly, telling us to stay put, and that he was on his way to help. When Mass Monster arrived, he brought more supplies and some equipment to help us stay off the grid. He also had some information about a final hidden altar that we had missed. This altar was the key to breaking the ritual completely. With Mass Monster's help, we planned our next move. We knew it would be dangerous, but we were determined to finish what we had started. If we could destroy the final altar, we might be able to stop Lumini and end the disappearances for good. We set out the next morning, following Mass Monster's directions. The final altar was deep in the forest in a place that was difficult to reach. It took us all day to get there, and by the time we arrived, it was dark. The altar was hidden in a cave, surrounded by more of the strange symbols. We entered the cave, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The altar was at the back, a large stone slab covered in even more intricate carvings. We knew this was it. We had to destroy it. Mike and Mass Monster took turns with the crowbar, each strike echoing through the cave. As the altar began to crack, the ground beneath us started to shake. It felt like the whole forest was reacting to what we were doing. We kept going, determined to finish the job. Finally, the altar shattered, the shaking stopped, and a sense of calm washed over us. We took photos of the broken altar and made our way back to the entrance of the cave. As we stepped outside, we felt a sense of relief. We had done it. We knew Lumini would come after us, but for now, we had won. We made our way back to Mike's house, knowing we had done everything we could to stop the disappearances. We were exhausted, but we felt a sense of accomplishment. We had faced our fears and taken action, and it had made a difference. This is going to sound crazy, but here's the final update. After everything that happened, I can't believe how it all turned out. A few days after we destroyed the final altar, things started to change. People in the town were talking about strange sightings in the forest. I heard stories about people who had disappeared suddenly reappearing. At first, I thought it was just rumors, but then I saw it with my own eyes. I was at Mike's place when I got a call from my neighbor, Mrs. Thompson. She was frantic, saying her son David, who had gone missing months ago, had just walked into their house like nothing happened. I rushed over to see for myself. When I got there, David was sitting in their living room, looking confused but unharmed. He didn't remember much about where he'd been, just bits and pieces. More people started coming back. Every day there were more reports of missing people returning home. It was surreal. I couldn't figure out what was going on. I mean, we had just destroyed the altars, and now everyone was coming back. It didn't make any sense. Then, the truth came out. There was a big announcement on the news. Turns out, the whole thing was a global prank by an organization called Estacosa Premium. They specialize in elaborate large-scale pranks, and this one was their biggest yet. They had staged everything from the disappearances to the creepy rituals, and even the Lumini group. They had actors, hidden cameras, the whole works. The people who disappeared had been in on it, sort of. They had been taken to a safe place and were told it was part of a social experiment. They didn't know the full extent of the prank, just that they needed to stay hidden for a while. When we destroyed the altars, it triggered their return as part of the prank's big reveal. I was furious at first. I mean, this prank had caused so much fear and stress. People thought their loved ones were gone forever. But then, seeing everyone come back and the relief on their families' faces, it was hard to stay mad. The Prank Society issued a public apology, explaining that their goal was to create awareness about how easily people can be manipulated by fear. They wanted to show the power of belief and how it can affect communities. The prank got mixed reactions. Some people were angry, feeling it was in bad taste. Others saw the humor and the message behind it. Personally, I was just glad everyone was safe. So, that's the end of the story. It was a wild ride, and I'm still processing everything that happened. I learned a lot about fear, trust, and how easily things can get out of hand. I'm just relieved that everyone is back and that the whole thing wasn't as sinister as it seemed. If you're reading this, thanks for following along. Stay safe, and maybe don't believe everything you see. Sometimes, reality is stranger than fiction. Take care, everyone. I put me and my family in danger because of the dark web. Before we start, I want to say all the real names will be replaced with fake ones. Hello, Reddit. My name is John. Right now, in my last year of college. But this story happened years ago. This happened when mystery boxes openings were a trend on YouTube. Back then I was watching all these videos on YouTube about how people were opening mystery boxes from the dark web. This was really interesting to my high school mind back then. I watched video after video like there is no tomorrow. You can say I was obsessed with dark web mystery boxes. What I didn't understand and know at the time is that all those videos were fake and staged. One day I decided to learn about how to access the dark web. I watched a few tutorials and there was downloading Tor and a VPN. Tor is a browser to access the dark web, and a VPN is just a safety measurement. So after I did all of that, I was on the dark web. I quickly found a website selling mystery boxes. Most of them offered different-sized mystery boxes for different prices, and they wanted Bitcoin for payment. I didn't know how to get Bitcoin, so they were not an option for me. Then after searching and scrolling for a while, I found a website where you can pay with a credit card. I still didn't have my own back then. So I waited one day when my parents weren't home, and I used theirs. You probably already know I did something very stupid the moment I paid with credit card, right? I mean, sharing your personal information on the dark web is the worst thing you can do. I even wrote down my street and house number, but I didn't know back then. And looking back now, if I paid with Bitcoin and ordered it on another address back then, maybe, just maybe, I wouldn't put myself and anyone else in danger. So after paying, I put the credit card back from where I took it. After a few days, the package was here. The only bad thing is that I didn't find it first. It was my mom. I still remember I was in my room, and I heard my mother screaming from the kitchen. I run straight down to my mother. I asked if she was okay. She didn't say anything, not a single word. She was just terrified. When I took a look inside the box, that is when I realized what I had done. I don't know how much I can say about what was inside the box because I don't want this post to get taken down. I will just say it was something very disturbing. There was also, besides that disturbing stuff, I don't want to talk and think about a CD. And also, there was another smaller box with pictures. They were pictures of me and my family. After seeing all that, my mother asked, "What is going on? What the hell is this?" She said that she will call the police. I was extremely scared now to not get in trouble. So I stopped her. I told her about what I have done. I told her that I ordered a mystery box from the dark web. She didn't know what the dark web is, so I had to explain that as well. After telling her everything to this day, I still remember that slap. She slapped me so hard, yelling at me, "What the hell is wrong with you? Are you stupid?" I think I even started crying, saying I am sorry. Then she gave me a hug. Then after a while we calmed down and she said, "Let's see what is on that CD." On that CD was how the dude who sent us, more specifically me, the disturbing stuff inside the box, how he got that stuff. The video was so disturbing, my mother just shut it off. She said, "We are waiting for your father to get home, then we are going to the police." After a few hours, my father got home. My mom explained everything to him. Then he got mad and started yelling at me. I deserved it. We all went to the police. There I didn't say a single word. My parents explained to them what I had done. I was lucky at the time because I was still 17. If I was 18, they could legally hold me there for questioning and stuff, I think. I'm not sure. We left the box at the police station and then we went home. When we got home, I went straight to my room. The next morning, I got up and got ready for school. I didn't say a word to my parents, neither did they. I left for school, and shortly after me, my parents left as well. They had work. They always left in the morning and came back at night, around 9. So I was always first to come home. So while I was at school, I wasn't exactly happy that day to be there. I was spacing out. The classes passed fast before I even noticed. When I went home, the first thing I noticed is that the front door was open. The first thing I did was enter inside and I yelled, "Mom, Dad, is that you?" But there was no one inside. Inside the living room, it was a mess. I quickly called my parents. They told me to go to our neighbor's house. Then police arrived at my house. Not long after, so did my parents. My mom came to my scared, asked me if I'm okay. I said I'm fine, I was at school. Then she thanked our neighbor for keeping an eye on me while she arrived. Then she took my hand and we went to where my father is and where the police is. He said that the police said it was a burglary, but we all knew this was happening because of what I did. For a few days, the police said that we need to find another place to stay at. We couldn't take any of our stuff because that was a crime scene now. They knew our situation with the dark web, so they sent us 2 police officers just for our safety. We rented a hotel room and stayed there for 2 or 3 days. The days passed so slow there. I wasn't allowed to go anywhere. I watched TV all day long. Then I remember we went back to our house again. We took our stuff and we were ready to leave. I asked my parents where we are going. My father angrily answered, "You shut the firm up. This is happening because of you and your stupidity. So just shut up. Sit there and don't say anything. I don't want to hear your voice." So I just sat at the back seat quietly, and after a few hours' drive, I knew where we were going. We were going over to my grandparents' house. We stayed there for a few weeks. I know I was grounded and I couldn't go outside. My phone, my computer, and everything I had of technology was taken from me. I lived like that for nearly a month. That is when we moved again. This time the move was bigger. When I say bigger, I mean another country. My parents found another job there. I went to a different school. I was forced to learn a new language. At home, when I say we, I mean me and my parents. We made a promise or a deal, or call it whatever you want, not to talk about happened to anyone. If someone asked us why we moved, I was supposed to answer because of my parents' work. But not everything was dark as you think. I liked it here. I made new friends. After a while, I got closer to my parents again. I even had a girlfriend for a while, but she left me after a few months. I made a new best friend named Leon. I was having a blast here. This new start was good for me. That is why Reddit stay away from dangerous situations on the dark web. Maybe the dark web is not dangerous if you know how to stay safe, I don't know. But if you listen to my just don't order anything from there, don't even go on there. There is nothing for you there. Thanks for listening to my story. All I can say is that I learned my lesson. A few months ago, I was browsing some forums and dark websites out of sheer curiosity. You hear a lot about the dark web and its mysteries, and like any curious person, I wanted to see what it was all about. I knew the dangers and took precautions with a VPN and other security measures. I mostly stumbled upon typical black market stuff that was illegal. But then I found something that really stood out. It was a simple post on a relatively obscure forum. The title read, "VR Experiment, $50,000 compensation." I clicked on it, half expecting it to be a scam or some joke. But the more I read, the more genuine it seemed. The post detailed a virtual reality experiment that aimed to push the boundaries of human experience. Participants would be fully immersed in a custom-built VR world, with the promise of groundbreaking technology that went beyond anything available to the public. They were offering $50,000 for just a few weeks of participation. The catch: participants had to sign an extensive non-disclosure agreement and go through a stringent selection process. The money was enticing, especially since I was dealing with mounting student loans and a dead-end job. But something about it felt off. The post emphasized the need for complete isolation during the experiment and hinted at potential psychological stress. I decided to ignore it. It sounded too good to be true, and I wasn't about to risk my sanity or safety for a quick payday. But the thought lingered in my mind, gnawing at me every time I checked my bank balance or received another collection call. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was letting a life-changing opportunity slip through my fingers. A few weeks passed, and I tried to push the thought out of my head. Life went on as usual, mundane and predictable. But one night, while scrolling through news articles online, I stumbled upon a headline that made my blood run cold. "Participants trapped in VR experiment, brain damage risk." The article was a detailed expose on the very experiment I had considered joining. According to the report, a rogue developer had taken control of the VR system, trapping the participants inside. The technology, which was supposed to be revolutionary, had a sinister flaw. If participants were forcibly removed from the VR world, it would cause irreversible brain damage. They were stuck in a digital nightmare with no clear way out. The article went on to describe the horror stories from the families of those trapped. One woman's husband, a software engineer, had been a participant. She described how he had become increasingly withdrawn before the experiment, following the strict isolation protocol. Now she was left with only cryptic messages from the developers, promising that they were working on a solution. What struck me the most were the descriptions of the participants' conditions. They were in a state of suspended animation, their bodies hooked up to life support systems, while their minds were lost in a virtual maze. Some families had tried to take legal action, but the NDAs were airtight. There was no way to hold the developers accountable. I couldn't believe what I was reading. If I had taken that offer, I could have been one of those poor souls trapped in a digital hell. The thought made me shudder. I felt a mix of relief and guilt, knowing that I had narrowly escaped such a fate while others were suffering. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the details from the article, imagining what it must be like for those trapped in the VR world. I thought about the families desperate for answers and the participants caught in a nightmare with no escape. The dark web had always seemed like a place of curiosity and danger, but now it felt all too real and terrifying. After reading that article, I couldn't stop thinking about those people trapped in VR. Imagine being stuck in a video game with no way out, and your body is in a hospital bed. It was like something out of a horror movie, but it was real. I started searching online for more information. I found a few more articles and some discussions on tech forums. It was all very secretive because of the non-disclosure agreements, but there were leaks and rumors from people who claimed to know someone involved. The story was always the same. The participants were stuck in the VR world, and they couldn't be safely removed because the tech was messed up. The more I read, the more disturbing it got. The participants were in hospitals all over, lying in comas, hooked up to life support machines, and still wearing their VR headsets. Doctors had tried to remove the headsets but quickly realized it caused severe problems. One guy started having a seizure when they tried to take it off. The doctors immediately put the headset back on, afraid they had already done damage. The families of the participants were devastated. They were always at the hospital, talking to their loved ones, holding their hands, hoping for a miracle. But the participants were unresponsive, their minds lost somewhere else. Some families tried to get help from the developers, but they either didn't respond or gave vague reassurances that they were working on it. One of the saddest stories was about a young guy named Alex. He was a smart, tech-savvy college student, excited to be part of the experiment. His parents said he had become withdrawn in the weeks leading up to the experiment, following the isolation rules. Now, they were left with nothing but memories of his enthusiasm and the harsh reality of his lifeless body in a hospital bed. It was so frustrating. How could this happen? How could these developers let these people suffer like this? And where was the oversight? Who was holding these people accountable? The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. But there was nothing I could do. I was just someone who had luckily avoided this nightmare. Then I found a user on a tech forum who claimed to have insider information. This person, who went by the username Tech Savvy Insider, said they worked for a company involved in developing the VR tech used in the experiment. They said the problem was way bigger than anyone knew, and that the company was trying to cover it up to avoid a massive scandal. According to Tech Savvy Insider, the VR system used a new kind of neural interface that directly interacted with the brain. It was supposed to create the most immersive experience ever, but it was still experimental and had many unknowns. The rogue developer who trapped the participants had exploited a flaw in the system, making it impossible to disconnect without causing brain damage. The company was scrambling to find a solution, but progress was slow, and they were running out of time. I reached out to Tech Savvy Insider, hoping to get more information. To my surprise, they responded. We started chatting privately, and they shared more details. They said the company was under immense pressure, and there were rumors that some higher-ups wanted to just cut their losses and shut everything down, leaving the participants trapped forever. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This was a nightmare, and it seemed like there was no way out. The families were being kept in the dark, the participants were stuck in a digital prison, and the company was more concerned about its reputation than saving lives. After talking with Tech Savvy Insider, I felt a mix of emotions. I felt really sad for the people trapped in VR, but I was also feeling incredibly lucky that I didn't sign up for it. It was a close call, and knowing how badly things turned out for those who did sign up made me appreciate my normal, boring life a lot more. I couldn't stop thinking about those people. They couldn't eat, speak, or move. Their bodies were in hospitals, hooked up to all sorts of machines and IVs to keep them alive. The thought of them lying there helpless was heartbreaking. Their minds were somewhere else entirely, probably stuck in some nightmare VR scenario, while their families were left with empty shells of their loved ones. I read more about how they were being kept alive. They were on infusions, getting nutrients through tubes because they couldn't eat. The doctors had to turn them and clean them because they couldn't move. It was like they were in a coma, but worse because there was no telling if or when they would wake up. One story that really got to me was about a woman named Lisa. She had a young daughter and had signed up for the experiment, hoping to make some quick money for her family. Now her daughter was left without her mom, and her husband was trying to hold things together while spending every free moment at the hospital. He described how Lisa looked so peaceful, like she was just sleeping, but he knew her mind was trapped in a digital prison. I felt so guilty for feeling relieved that it wasn't me, but at the same time I couldn't shake the feeling that I had dodged a bullet. What if I had taken the offer? I would be in that hospital bed right now, my mind lost in some VR nightmare. I kept in touch with Tech Savvy Insider, hoping to learn more. They told me that the company was trying different ways to safely disconnect the participants, but nothing had worked so far. Every attempt seemed to cause more harm than good. The developers were under a lot of pressure, and there were even rumors of some of them quitting because they couldn't handle the guilt. It was a mess. The company was facing lawsuits from the families, but because of the NDAs, it was a legal nightmare. The families were desperate for answers, and the participants were stuck in limbo, unable to wake up and unable to escape the VR world. I wanted to help, but I didn't know how. All I could do was keep digging for information and hope that somehow, some way, a solution would be found. I spent hours every day searching for updates, reading every article, and following every lead. It was like an obsession, but I couldn't let it go. I felt like I owed it to those people to keep looking for answers, even if I couldn't do much to help. The more I learned, the more hopeless it seemed. The technology that was supposed to be so advanced had turned into a trap. The people who had signed up for the experiment were paying the price, and their families were suffering too. It was a nightmare, and there was no end in sight. I thought about visiting one of the hospitals to see it for myself, but I was scared. I didn't know if I could handle seeing those people in person. I kept thinking about their families, how they must feel seeing their loved ones like that every day. Months went by, and I kept up with the story. Every day I hoped to hear some good news. The pressure on the company was huge, and they couldn't hide anymore. People were talking about it everywhere, and it was all over the news. Then one day I saw an article that gave me a bit of hope. Some of the people trapped in the VR had actually managed to wake up and remove the headset without any problems. The doctors and developers were shocked. They didn't understand why some people could wake up safely while others couldn't. But for those who woke up, it was like a miracle. They were weak and confused, but alive and out of the VR. The article interviewed one of the survivors, a guy named Mark. He said the VR world was like a twisted, changing nightmare. He felt like he had been in there for years, even though it was only a few months. Mark was just so happy to be out and wanted to move on with his life and forget the whole thing. But not everyone had a happy ending. Some people never woke up. They died with the VR headset still on. Their bodies couldn't take it anymore. The families of those who died were devastated. They had hoped for so long, only to have it end in tragedy. One really sad story was about a man named Joe. His wife and kids had been by his side every day. When he died, they were heartbroken. His wife talked to the press, saying how unfair it was and how the experiment had ruined their lives. She was so angry at the company, and I totally understood why. For the families of those who woke up, it was a mix of happiness and anger. They were glad to have their loved ones back, but they were also really mad at the company for putting them through such a nightmare. Many of them talked about suing the company to get some justice. As for me, I felt a strange mix of relief and guilt. I was so glad I hadn't signed up for the experiment, but I couldn't stop thinking about those who had. I kept in touch with Tech Savvy Insider, who told me that the company was still trying to figure out why some people woke up and others didn't. They were looking at everything, health, age, even mental state, but they had no clear answers yet. I couldn't help but feel for those still trapped. There were still people out there, stuck in that VR world, and no one knew if they would ever wake up. The families of those still trapped were living in constant fear. waiting for news, hoping for a miracle. I joined an online support group for the families of the trapped participants. I thought maybe I could help in some way, even if it was just by listening. The stories I heard were so sad. Parents, spouses, siblings, all desperate for answers, all hoping for a miracle. As the months went by, a few more people woke up. Each time it was like a small victory, but it also made the losses even harder. For every person who woke up, there were many who didn't. Months turned into a year, and the story kept developing. One day I got the chance to interview one of the survivors, a guy named David. He agreed to talk to me about his experience inside the VR world. I was nervous, but also really curious to hear his story firsthand. When I met David, he looked like he had been through a lot. He was still recovering, but he was eager to share his experience. He started by explaining what it was like inside the VR world. According to David, they were trapped in some kind of horror game. It was designed to be terrifying, with creepy environments and dangerous challenges. The most disturbing part was that the game had a final boss they needed to defeat in order for everyone to wake up. David described the boss as incredibly overpowered. It was something out of a nightmare, huge, menacing, and seemingly invincible. No matter how hard they tried, they couldn't beat it. They kept respawning in the game after every defeat, but they also felt the pain of dying, stuck in an endless cycle of trying and failing. David said the situation was dire. People were losing hope, and the fear and stress were getting to everyone. But then, something unexpected happened. A young girl, about 16 or 17 years old, managed to do what no one else could. Her name was Emily. Emily was quiet and seemed unassuming, but she had a natural talent for the game. David said she was incredibly focused and determined. While everyone else was starting to give up, Emily kept pushing forward. She studied the boss's patterns, figured out its weaknesses, and came up with a strategy. One day, while everyone else was at their lowest point, Emily went into the final battle again. She fought the boss with a level of skill and precision that stunned everyone. After a long and intense fight, she managed to defeat the boss. It was a moment of disbelief and overwhelming joy. As soon as the boss was defeated, they all felt a strange sensation, like waking up from a deep sleep. David described the feeling of waking up in the hospital, the VR headset finally being removed without any pain or damage. He and the others who had survived were incredibly grateful to Emily. She had saved them all from what seemed like an endless nightmare. I asked David how Emily was doing now. He said she was still recovering, like the rest of them, but she was hailed as a hero by everyone who had been trapped. She didn't talk much about what she did. She was just happy that they were all free. The interview with David left me with a mix of emotions. I was relieved that some of them had made it out, but I also felt the weight of those who didn't. The experience had changed them all forever. The company faced severe legal consequences, and the technology was banned until it could be made completely safe. Months turned into a year, and the story kept developing. One day, I got the chance to interview one of the survivors, a guy named David. He agreed to talk to me about his experience inside the VR world. I was nervous, but also really curious to hear his story firsthand. When I met David, he looked like he had been through a lot. He was still recovering, but he was eager to share his experience. He started by explaining what it was like inside the VR world. According to David, they were trapped in some kind of horror game. It was designed to be terrifying, with creepy environments and dangerous challenges. The most disturbing part was that the game had a final boss they needed to defeat in order for everyone to wake up. David described the boss as incredibly overpowered. It was something out of a nightmare, huge, menacing, and seemingly invincible. No matter how hard they tried, they couldn't beat it. They kept respawning in the game after every defeat, stuck in an endless cycle of trying and failing. David said the situation was dire. People were losing hope, and the fear and stress were getting to everyone. But then something unexpected happened. A young girl, about 16 or 17 years old, managed to do what no one else could. Her name was Emily. Emily was quiet and seemed unassuming, but she had a natural talent for the game. David said she was incredibly focused and determined, while everyone else was starting to give up. Emily kept pushing forward. She studied the boss's patterns, figured out its weaknesses, and came up with a strategy. One day, while everyone else was at their lowest point, Emily went into the final battle again. She fought the boss with a level of skill and precision that stunned everyone. After a long and intense fight, she managed to defeat the boss. It was a moment of disbelief and overwhelming joy. As soon as the boss was defeated, they all felt a strange sensation, like waking up from a deep sleep. It all started a few months ago when I lost my job. I was desperate, broke, and on the brink of being evicted. I spent countless nights scrolling through job boards, but nothing seemed to fit. One night, while aimlessly browsing Reddit, I stumbled upon a thread about making quick money. Most of the suggestions were either ridiculous or borderline illegal, but one comment caught my eye. Make a quick buck on the dark web. Now, I'd always heard about the dark web in hushed whispers. A place where anything goes, from drugs to hiring hitmen. It sounded like a terrible idea, but desperation can make you do crazy things. I figured, what's the harm in looking? So, I did a bit of research. It didn't take long to find guides on accessing the dark web. Armed with a VPN and Tor browser, I dove in. The interface was surprisingly simple, a stark contrast to the horrors it supposedly contained. I explored a bit, finding forums, marketplaces, and chat rooms. The sheer volume of illegal activities was overwhelming, but I was here for one reason: money. I found a forum dedicated to scams. The users were boasting about their latest scores and offering tips on how to get started. I was hesitant at first, but then I saw a post about a phishing scheme. It seemed straightforward. Create a fake website that looks legitimate, trick people into entering their personal information, and sell that information to interested buyers. It sounded easy enough, and honestly, it seemed like a victimless crime. Just a bit of data theft, right? I spent the next week designing a fake banking website. It was alarmingly easy to make it look convincing. I bought a similar domain name, set up the site, and started sending out emails. At first, nothing happened, but then a few days later, I got my first hit. Someone entered their login information, and I felt a rush of excitement and guilt. I repeated the process, tweaking the site and emails to make them more convincing. Soon, I had gathered a decent amount of data. I was ready to sell. I returned to the forum and posted what I had. Within hours, I had multiple offers. The highest bidder was willing to pay $5,000 for the entire package. It was more money than I had seen in months, and I jumped at the offer. The transaction went smoothly, and I received the payment in Bitcoin. For a moment, I felt like a genius. I had found a way out of my financial woes. But that moment of euphoria didn't last long. The next morning, I woke up to a message on the forum from the buyer. He claimed that some of the information was fake and demanded a refund. I knew for a fact that everything I had provided was legitimate, and I told him so. The buyer didn't take it well. He threatened to expose me if I didn't return the money. I panicked. I didn't have the money to give back, and I couldn't risk being exposed. I blocked him and hoped that would be the end of it. But then the real nightmare began. A few days later, I received an email from an anonymous sender. The subject line simply read, "You're dead." My heart pounded as I opened it. The email contained my home address, my daily routine, and pictures of me taken without my knowledge. The message was clear: refund the money or else. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't go to the police. I was involved in illegal activities. I tried to ignore it, but the threats kept coming. They knew everything about me, every movement, every interaction. It was like they were inside my head. One night, as I was trying to fall asleep, I heard a noise outside my window. I froze, my heart beating out of my chest. I listened intently, straining to hear anything. Then I saw a shadow move across my window. I leaped out of bed and grabbed a baseball bat from my closet. With shaking hands, I approached the window and peered outside. Nothing. I was losing my mind. I started seeing shadows everywhere, hearing whispers in the dark. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I was constantly on edge, expecting something terrible to happen at any moment. And then, one night, it did. I was sitting in my living room trying to distract myself with some TV when I heard the sound of glass breaking. I jumped up, my heart racing. The front door burst open, and 3 masked men stormed in. Before I could react, they were on me, pinning me to the ground. One of them pressed a knife to my throat. "We warned you," he hissed. "You shouldn't have ignored us." I tried to explain, to beg for my life, but they weren't interested. They tied me up and ransacked my apartment, taking anything of value. As they left, one of them leaned down and whispered in my ear, "You have 1 week to return the money. If you don't, we'll be back, and next time, we won't be so nice." I was left tied up on the floor, trembling with fear. It took hours for me to free myself, and by then, I knew what I had to do. I had to get the money back somehow. But I was running out of time, and I had no idea how far these people were willing to go. The first thing I did was look around my apartment. I sold everything I could, my TV, my laptop, my gaming console, anything that had some value. But that only got me so far. I still needed a lot more. I started looking for any job I could get. I picked up multiple part-time gigs, sometimes working 16-hour days. I delivered food, walked dogs, even did some cleaning jobs. Anything that paid, I did it. I was exhausted and barely sleeping. But I had to keep going. I felt like every minute counted down to something terrible. But even with all the work, I wasn't getting the money fast enough. I had to ask friends and family for loans, and that was hard. I've always been pretty independent, and admitting I was in deep trouble was embarrassing. I called my parents first. They knew I'd lost my job, but they had no idea how bad things were. I made up a story about needing money for an emergency, but I could tell they were disappointed. They helped me out, but it wasn't a lot. They're not wealthy themselves. Next, I called my closest friends. I told them I was in a tight spot and needed some help. Most of them didn't ask too many questions and lent me what they could. It wasn't much, but every bit helped. I even reached out to people I hadn't talked to in years. Old college friends, distant relatives, anyone who might help. It was awkward, and I hated it. Some people were kind and helped. Others were skeptical or just said no. I couldn't blame them. It was a weird request out of the blue. As the days went by, I managed to scrape together a decent amount, but I was still short. I kept working, kept asking. The fear of those guys coming back kept me going. I couldn't afford to stop, not even for a moment. I was always looking over my shoulder, jumping at every noise. Every time I left my apartment, I was paranoid someone was following me. I couldn't shake the feeling they were watching, waiting for me to mess up. One night, after another long day of working, I got a call from an old friend. He'd heard from a mutual friend that I was in trouble and offered to lend me some money. I couldn't believe my luck. We met up, and he handed me a wad of cash. It wasn't enough to cover the whole debt, but it got me closer. As the week ended, I was still short of the full amount. I sent what I had managed to gather, hoping it would buy me more time. I sent the money through Bitcoin and waited. The next day I got another message. "This is not enough. You have 3 more days." My heart sank. 3 days to find the rest of the money or face whatever they had planned. I didn't know how I was going to do it, but I had no choice. I started working even harder, picking up every shift I could, taking on more jobs. I barely slept, barely ate. I was running on pure adrenaline and fear. My friends noticed something was wrong, but I couldn't tell them the full story. I just said I was going through a rough patch. I knew I was running out of time, and I didn't know if I could pull it off. But I had to keep going. I couldn't let those guys get to me again. I had to find a way to come up with the rest of the money. I was desperate, so I had to sell my watch. This wasn't just any watch. It was a birthday gift from my dad. He gave it to me on my 18th birthday, and it meant a lot to me. But I had no choice. I took it to a pawn shop, and they didn't give me nearly what it was worth, but it got me a bit closer to the amount I needed. Next, I took everything I had left in the bank. My savings were pretty much gone by this point, but I pulled out every last dollar. It wasn't much, but I was determined to get this done. Every bit helped, and I was inching closer to the total. I worked every minute I could, taking on any job I could find. It was exhausting, but I couldn't stop. I needed to get the money together. The thought of those guys coming back kept me going, no matter how tired or hungry I was. Finally, after days of working nonstop, asking everyone I knew for help, and selling everything I could, I managed to scrape together the full amount. It was a huge relief, but I knew I wasn't safe yet. I had to get the money to them without putting myself in even more danger. I knew I couldn't meet them face to face. They could just take the money and kill me anyway. I had to be smart about this. I decided to leave the money in a location and send them the details. It felt like something out of a movie, but I didn't have any other choice. I found an old abandoned building on the outskirts of town. It was run down and creepy, but it seemed like the perfect place. I went there at night, carrying a bag with all the money I had gathered. My heart was pounding, and I was terrified someone was watching me. I found a spot inside the building and left the bag there. Then I quickly got out of there and headed home. As soon as I got back, I sent a message to the guys with the location of the money. I included a photo to show them it was all there. I waited, my heart racing, hoping they would be satisfied and this would all be over. Hours went by with no response. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I just sat there staring at my phone, waiting for any sign that they had gotten the money. Finally, I got a message. "We got the money. This better be the end of it." I let out a huge sigh of relief. It seemed like they were satisfied and I was safe, at least for now. But even with the money paid back, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. They knew where I lived. They knew everything about me. I felt like I was always being watched, always on edge. I hoped this was the end of my ordeal, but a part of me knew it might not be over. I had gotten myself into this mess and I wasn't sure if I could ever really get out of it. But for now, I was just glad to be alive. After I got that message saying they got the money and it better be the end of it, I tried to go back to my normal life. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I stepped outside, I felt paranoid. Every car that drove by, every person that looked my way, I felt like they were watching me. One night, I was lying in bed trying to sleep when I heard a noise outside my window. My heart started pounding. I got up slowly and peeked through the blinds. I saw a figure standing in the shadows, just staring at my window. I froze. I quickly called the police, but when they arrived, the person was gone. They did a quick look around, but didn't find anything. They told me it was probably nothing, maybe just a neighbor or someone passing by. But I knew better. I knew they were watching me. The next few days were a blur. I was constantly on edge, barely sleeping, barely eating. Then, one night, it happened. I was coming home from one of my jobs, and as I was unlocking my front door, I felt a sharp pain in my side. I looked down and saw blood. Someone had stabbed me. I turned around and saw one of the masked guys from before. He had a knife in his hand and a look of pure hatred in his eyes. I fought back, kicking and screaming, and somehow managed to break free. I ran as fast as I could, not looking back. I knew I couldn't go back to my apartment. It wasn't safe anymore. I ran to a friend's house and pounded on the door until they answered. I must have looked terrible, bleeding and panicked, but they let me in and called an ambulance. At the hospital, I told the doctors I was mugged. I couldn't tell them the truth. After I was patched up, I went to the police and reported the attack, but again I couldn't tell them the whole story. I just said it was a random mugging. They took my statement and said they'd investigate, but I knew there wasn't much they could do. I couldn't stay at my friend's place. I didn't want to put them in danger, so I grabbed some essentials and left. I've been on the run ever since, moving from place to place, trying to stay off the radar. I stay in cheap motels, sometimes sleeping in my car. I'm always looking over my shoulder, always paranoid. I've cut off contact with most people I know. It's too risky. I've only told a few close friends what's really going on, and they've been helping me as much as they can. But it's tough. I'm constantly scared, constantly tired. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. I'm writing this from yet another motel room. I don't know what my next move is. I just know I need to keep moving, keep hiding. I don't know if these guys will ever stop looking for me. I don't know if I'll ever be safe again. So after running and hiding for what felt like forever, I was exhausted and desperate. I was running out of places to go and options to try. I was scared all the time and didn't know who to trust. One night, I was at a bar in a town I'd never been to before, just trying to keep a low profile. I struck up a conversation with a guy sitting next to me. He seemed friendly enough, and I needed someone to talk to. Turns out, this guy was more than just a regular dude at the bar. He had connections, money, and power. His name was Mike. As we talked, I ended up spilling a bit of my story, not everything, but enough for him to get the idea that I was in deep trouble. To my surprise, he offered to help. Mike told me he had dealt with people like the ones after me before, and that he had the resources to make them back off for good. I was skeptical at first, but what choice did I have? I was at the end of my rope. I told him everything, and he listened without judging. The next day, Mike made some calls. I don't know exactly what he did or who he talked to, but within a few days, the threats stopped. No more shadowy figures, no more threatening messages. It was like a huge weight lifted off my shoulders. I could finally breathe again. But Mike's help didn't come for free. He told me I'd have to work for him to pay off the favor. I didn't mind. After everything I'd been through, I was just grateful to be alive, so I started working for him, doing whatever he needed. Sometimes it was legit work, sometimes it was a bit shady, but nothing illegal. I wasn't about to go down that road again. I've been working my ass off for Mike ever since. It's tough, but it's a lot better than running for my life. I've managed to save up a bit of money, and I'm slowly getting my life back on track. It's not the life I imagined for myself, but it's a life, and I'm alive. I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully relax or trust people the same way again. The experience has left me scarred and always looking over my shoulder. But I'm trying to move forward, one day at a time. So, that's my story. It's been a wild ride, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone. If there's one thing I've learned, it's to be careful what you get yourself into. Desperation can make you do crazy things, but sometimes the price you pay is far greater than you ever imagined. Thanks for listening, everyone. Stay safe out there and stay away from the dark web.